Hello everyone. I will try not to deviate from the speech. Yesterday I have 1 or 15 minutes. I took an hour and a half. I'm going to try. I want to start by thanking the authorities of the Chamber of Commerce for inviting us to be here today with you. And congratulate them for the immense achievement of inaugurating this building. It is a pleasure for me to see this powerful organization grow, proponents of Argentine economic life. In fact, it is a pleasure to hear Manuel speak. This year has been a turning point in our history. A period of transition between a century of misery that comes to an end and a prosperous future for us and our children that has been born. It has been difficult for everyone, but at the same time very necessary. Again, I thank you for having trusted in this government. Unlike the politicians we had gotten used to, we always knew that the only way out was with a government plan based on uncomfortable truths and not on empty promises. I do not want to dwell too much on what I already expressed a few days ago in the national speech. But what we proposed when we started the mandate was a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of the GDP, applying escrow to the monetary mission to stop feeding the inflationary monster, and a strong change anchor to strengthen the weight in time. The experts, as always, those who never had their own achievements and who are collectors of failures, said it was impossible. Only the economic team led by Toto Caputo and I bet on this program against everyone. They said that an adjustment of 1 point of the GDP could not be made in a year. And we ended up adjusting 5 points in the Treasury and 10 points in the central bank, making the biggest adjustment in history. To be aware of what was achieved, when you look at the history of Argentina in the last 123 years, we had a fiscal deficit in 113. And in the year when we did not have a fiscal deficit, it was because we were in default. And we did not pay the interest. In other words, we never had the fiscal balance. And when we said that we were going to a deficit zero program, they told us it was impossible. They said it was crazy to believe that it could be adjusted more than 1 point per year. And thanks to the enormous work of Toto Caputo and all his team, we reached the fiscal balance in the first month of our administration. So they started with the fact that it was a blender, that there were scissors, that there was no chainsaw. In fact, the adjustment was 7 points of the GDP. And given that we were aware that the increase in savings that we were generating was not going to have a setback in investment, we knew that from the beginning we were going to have a fall in the level of economic activity. And that while we were sincere in the economy, obviously their sincerity implied a jump in poverty. So we decided from Capitol Hill to give social compensation to the most vulnerable. While also in a joint action between Minister Petavila, the formidable and wonderful Minister Patricia Bullrich, and De Guillermo Ferrer, may he rest in peace. They did the phenomenal job of not only giving compensation to the most vulnerable, but the action allowed us to finish with the managers of poverty. We also lowered the number of ministries to 9. We eliminated secretaries, sub-secretaries, we eliminated certain state offices. Offices that, for example, were used to persecute ideological opponents. That is, to persecute liberals specifically, such as the Ministry of Women of the INADI, where every time one expressed the idea of freedom, they filed a hate speech complaint. That is, for them, hatred is to say that 2 plus 2 is 4. We also eliminated public work, a giant source of corruption in Argentine history. We also eliminated discretionary transfers to provinces. We eliminated subsidies. Not only did we also eliminate subsidies, but we also fired public employees. We ended hundreds of thousands of contracts. And there are still people who say that this was a lot of recurrences. That the adjustment was paid for by the people and not the caste. In fact, Ciro Carajutis ago said that the adjustment had been paid by the retirees. We are liars, Amol and Chambers to say something like that. Because public spending fell 30% in real times. While the number of retirees in real terms is above what it was in the month of November. And we met with the accounts when we seemed in December. Therefore, the retirees did not pay the adjustment, but the political caste paid for it. But it was not the only mechanism by which we generated monetary emissions. We had endogenous creation factors that derived from the paid passes of the central bank. There was a small detail. I did not know if I told Guido. But when we were about to resume the paid passives, which were on average 90 days, the previous government before leaving passed them in 1 day. And that meant that in a situation of macroeconomic commotion, we kicked in to pull the monetary base in a single day. Not only that, but we also had payments of debt in pesos, equivalent to $90,000 million, and not to mention the problems we had in terms of SIRA, which are close to $43,000 million, and heavy dividends that made a total account for the equivalent of $60,000 million. International reserves net negative in $12,000 million. And a gap that, at its worst, was at 200%. And there is a very interesting element. Because in the face of what a large part of the profession believes, in the face of what the International Monetary Fund asked, they said that we had to raise the interest rate. This is more of an academic discussion than an account plan. But I think it is worth making a small effort. From our point of view, we said that it is wrong for central banks to control the interest rates. From our point of view, the interest rate is an intertemporal coordination mechanism that allows us to transfer in time, whether it is consumption savings, which is the present consumption and investment. And that in reality, the interest rate exists because there is time, not because there is money. And in that sense, from our point of view, the control of the interest rate is a theoretical aberration, emanated from a theoretical calamity that was published in 1936, which is called the general theory of occupation of interest and money, by one of the most nefarious beings in economics, Mr. John Maynard Keynes, who wrote a work in favor of messianic, corrupt, thief politicians, where if things went well, it was thanks to the politicians, and if it went badly, it was the fault of everyone else. That concept has done a lot of damage to the debate. I say the economists, we spent 37 years arguing nonsense, until the validation of the empirical work of Robert Lucas Jr. In his paper in 1972, validated in 1973. Having said this, we went to control the amount of money, because in our perspective, inflation is not the increase in prices, but inflation is the loss of the purchasing power of money. If I take the first definition, inflation is fought with price controls. If the definition is the second, it is fought with monetary policy. In the first, it is the fault of the entrepreneurs, of the consumers, of the unionists. In the other, it is the fault of the politicians, or of the politicians who base themselves in the central bank. This is not a minor issue, and we made that bet. We started to fight against the quasi-fiscal deficit, which was 10 points of the GDP. And as we got control of the fiscal balance and the country's risk started to fall, this is a titanic task carried out by the president of the central bank, Santiago Borsali, and our enormous finance secretary, Dr. Pablo Cornau. They started with a task that seemed impossible, which was to clean the balance sheet of the central bank. And that was done all in the market. That is, there were no expropriations, there was no Bonex plan. And in 6 months they managed to clean the balance sheet of the central bank, to end the mechanisms of endogenous creation of money, and to eliminate inflation expectations by eliminating mechanisms of money creation. After the first 6 months of the government, our fiscal adjustment was made the equivalent of 15 points of the GDP. That is the largest adjustment in the history of humanity. Naturally, imagine in that context, they told us, well, but they are killing inflation, which is true. I am going to make a slight digression. And I am going to have a small disagreement with Manuel in terms of inflation. But we are going to be saying the same thing, but in a different way, which gives a different perspective. We believe that the wholesale inflation is the one that precedes the consumer inflation, and therefore the focus had to be on the wholesale inflation. And in fact, we are still doing it today. The wholesale inflation in the month of December 2024 had climbed to 54%. That in annual terms means 17,000%. That is situation we had. And the reality is that for that index to be effective, you had to have elements of monetary validation. Well, we had the problem of the surplus of money, which was twice what that of Rodriguez, which meant that the inflation rate could multiply between 12 and 15 times if the demand for money went to its level of nominal demand, which we also know is not true because it usually declines very below the nominal. We also had the problem of the 5 bases. The possibility of quintupling the monetary base in one day. And we also had the problem of the deficit of $90,000 million expressed in pesos. Therefore, all the foundations were laid for hyperinflation. I have seen some professionals truly of quality and amenable say, when they saw the type of change, make an analysis of the variation of the type of change to show this way was incorrect. It seems that they do not know how to differentiate between an index and the price of a financial asset. You know how the stock market is, you know what the difference is. You know that financial assets have something called volatility. In fact, when they buy options or sell options, volatility actually has value. But, well, let's say there's some of Argentina's monetary experts who seem to know very little about the financial market, and that is why they never understood what Basel, Kirchner, and above all, Capito were doing. But today, the latest data we have of wholesale inflation was 1.4%. It is the equivalent of an annual inflation of 18%. That is, we went from 17,000% to 18%. But you might argue that 1.4% per month is a lot. And I agree with you. I agree with that. What happens is part of our economic program. We have what is called induced inflation, which is the crawling pay plus international inflation. That is induced inflation because of the problems we inherited in the exchange market, especially in terms of stocks. A reason why we still cannot open this stock market. That we have an induced inflation per month of close to 2.5%. That is, if you look at dollars, wholesalers have 2 months with the equivalent of a 1% monthly deflation in dollars. That is, Argentina in dollars has an annual deflation of 13%. That is, Argentina is generating deflation. If one takes out the induced, he can tell me, well, but I don't care, because I care about consumer inflation. Okay, 2.5% per month. I would tell you that it is in line, let's say, with the induced inflation rate. But when you separate inflation, the trading goods and services, services increased by 4.4%, very high. Yes, by way has to do with the inflation of goods and services. Yes, by what has to do with tariff recompositions. While goods have been 1.6% inflation, that is, if I take it in terms of goods, I have deflation of almost 1%. If I take it in terms of food, which is 0.9, I have deflation by the equivalent of 1.5. And if I take it in terms of basic food basket, or basic total basket, which comes in around 1.5%, I have deflation by 1 point. That is, Argentina today has deflation in dollars. And therefore the numbers that you look at are distorted in some sense. by induced inflation. All this makes the best program of stabilization in history. Because although at the beginning, the numbers of convertibility, the best program of stabilization in history, until ours arrived, we worked more slowly. But today the result is much more powerful. In terms of deflation in dollars. And that was also done with how? A previous hyperinflation that liquefied the real balance sheets, which makes it very easy to stabilize later. We did not expropriate either, as is the Bonnex plan. We did not have price controls during the first transitional stage. In addition, unlike all previous Argentine programs, which first made a tariff adjustment to later show how they achieve low inflation towards relative pressure recomposition, they did it before. We did it and we are doing it during the program. In fact, when we took office, it only covered 10% of the price. And today we are close to 90%. In addition, we did not fix the exchange rate. So one has to make that correction. Therefore, our stabilization program is much more successful than a convertibility program. And as Manuel also mentioned, here's why Archer has made other references. And I say it especially with the respect and admiration that I have for Guido. He was truly a brave man who took charge of the central bank in a very complicated moment. And not thanks to the work that Guido did, fixing the amount of money in with the remains of monetary policy. Later on, in the first stage, he saw the inflation decelerate. And that is interesting, because later on, they began to issue the money. And they said, like you monetary people, do not understand anything, because we are issuing low inflation. He said, go and see, because they did and said that. So they stole your achievements, Guido. There you go, as I could only hear the presentation of Manuel. That's why I make these clarifications. But thank you, Guido, for your courage in that moment. As Manuel mentioned, we, in fact, today's a you. Since the Decree 70 is 2023, and that with the best claw represents a structural reform 8 times bigger than the reform man in debt, which was the biggest in the history of Argentina. Therefore, we have also jumped 70 positions in the ranking of economic freedom and work on it every day. That is the enormous task of Federal Costesniga, deregulating how much money is in the middle. And that is why we have the courage to say that we're creating the best government in the history of Argentina. And while we were doing this, they said that they were going to light up the country, and yet we managed to pacify the street, never giving in to the coercive instincts of professional agitators. This is also very important. To point out, when we assumed office there were about 8,000 pickets a year, and they said that it was impossible to end the picket. We ended the pickets thanks to enormous hands of Dr. Boris and Peter and Dilomay Faro. We ended them on the first day, and that which seemed impossible, we have made it possible. Not only that, in the matter of pickets, the previous government said that it had lost the fight against drug trafficking, and that Rosario was lost, and Dr. Boric designed a Bander plan and lowered the homicide 70% in Rosario. In short, a great number of achievements obtained against all the predictors, which show that history can change. Inside, we do not believe that politics is the art of the possible. We believe that politics is to make possible what everyone said was impossible. And the only thing we are doing is not inventing anything, but applying the menus and the recipes of freedom, ideas that started in 1860, which 35 years allowed Argentina to become a first world power. If they could do it in the 19th century, why can't we do it? In short, there is no reason to live in poverty or to give in to evil. It is only necessary to have clear ideas and the necessary conviction to carry them out. In other words, it happens that the program worked as we proposed it. Even in this cave, we have said it. This has surpassed 1 million people, and this has surpassed our own expectations. We want to clarify, because the reality is that we thought that, for example, the recession would be longer, and despite the time it took for the basic law to come out, even so, we touched the bottom between March and April 2024, and from there the economy began to expand at a 10% rate, or if you take the last quarter, it expanded at 3.9% rate. Annualized implies about 16% growth. They said that the inflation was going down because consumption was falling. However, it is growing at a 20% rate. They said that we were not going to have any investments. Investments are growing at a 50% rate. In short, the numbers are much better than we expected. The unemployment data, the most recent data, was 6.9%, having created 145,000 new jobs. The real salary has been growing since 6 or 7 months without stopping inflation. The average salary in dollars went from $300 to $1,100, and in the middle, we achieved something that seemed impossible, and that is that we were able to reduce poverty by about 20 points, and indigency went from more than 20% to levels between 8% and 9%. In other words, in recent months, 8 million Argentinians have escaped poverty. We are achieving it with the ideas of freedom. But it is worth clarifying that we were not experimenting with the life of the Argentinians. We were not improvising. In fact, here I am going to clarify again. There is an idiot who is very pedantic, very hacker, in a TV program that comes out once a week, which is about economics and politics. We said that we did not have a plan and were improvising. If I think about it, and as Pablo's teacher would say, I will say it in Latin, with the Colombo that we had in front of us, if we did not have an economic program, we would have failed. because we started doing this from day one. And it is very interesting because 2 days ago, a liberal economist named Ivan Carino found a book that, together with some colleagues, I published in 2014, and I had all the details of our economic program. And as Argentina has these things, that it was difficult for it to evolve. The problems were the same. So there's all the description of the economic program. That is to say that it had been the economic program for many years in my head. It was the whole campaign. That is why sometimes it seems strange to me, some things. But well, it will be that the gentleman in Christian hates and envies me. I mean, that is how they identify the liar, the fraud, the operator. Therefore, we were not improvising. We knew what we were doing. As for improvising, the truth is that we left it to the shamans of the economy, these creative methods of playing with fun money. We have suffered for too long, if not. In fact, Manuel pointed out this very well, the risks of populism. Precisely. Let's say, people who have made an art of violating the budget restriction. And this too here. Sometimes there is fortune. I remember that I was in the company of the Fantino, and at one point he said to me, but they are going to ask you for this. They are going to ask you for this. And I told him, Ale, I can't give them to you, but there is no money. There is no money. I can't give you something that I don't have, because there is no money. This phrase seems such an obvious thing. Well, in Argentina, it was not obvious, because for 123 years, we always had a fiscal deficit in Riga, and it was incredible what that generated, because it allowed the Argentinians to internalize something called the budget restriction. Something as basic as the budget restriction. Not only there, chimneys appeared all over the world that said there was no money, all kinds of souvenirs that said there was no money inside. Toto Caputo in his office. The less who are going to visit him has a bag of souvenirs, but said there is no money. That is, here the box is taken care of. And in that sense, it was an impressive impact, because there were even songs with there was no money. That is, then see how fortuitous fact. Before the question of an honest and well-intentioned journalist, how suddenly solutions appear that ordered us all. In fact, parents went out and the children asked him for things. So, do you like my law? There is no money. That is, it became a truly incredible mechanism, because in the end it is to respect the budget restriction, and we simply did what works. What has taken millions of people out of poverty over time and in the world, that is, applying the principles of freedom. Not for nothing, those countries that are freer are 12 times richer in terms of GDP per capita than the repressed, have 25 times less poor in the standard format, and 50 times in the extreme format. So I don't see where the argument is between embracing or not the principles of freedom. This is a phenomenal business. We, with the reforms we made, we advanced 70 positions in economic freedom. But this is our commitment, that the day I leave power, Argentina will be the freest country in the world. Do not have any doubts. Therefore, the balance today is a country with superior tax in a vertical process of economic recovery that has everything to continue growing. The signals have already shown that the economy is taking off at a vertiginous pace. As I said before, an inflation of 54% in December of 2023. We went to an inflation of 1.4% in November of this year, the lowest in 4 years. If we analyze the food sector, that has a high coincidence in the basic basket. We went from an inflation of 29.7 in December, from 23 to 0.9% last month. That is to say, the one that has direct influence on the poor and the needy went down 30 times. The exchange rate went from around 200%, that is a 3-to-1 ratio, when we assumed office to practically extinguished. The conditions to lower the crawling peg are almost given at 1%, and we are negotiating an agreement with the IMF fund for the first quarter of 2024, and thus be able to comply with the necessary conditions to get out of the grave once and for all. As I said, we have a commercial and energy fiscal surplus, and the country's risk that when we won was in the 3,000 basis points. When we assumed office, there were already people who were starting to see it, because it was 1900, and yesterday it was located below the 670 basis points. This has enormous implications in terms of interest rates, and this implies a strong reduction in the cost of capital. This allows us to accumulate capital, to raise the capital stock per capita, to generate economic growth, and that economic growth translates into an increase in productivity that implies a genuine increase in salaries. And that is the sincere path, the slowest path, but that reaches a good goal to end poverty once and for all. Therefore, it is the same concept. Argentinian shares did not stop rising. In Wall Street, they already exceeded a total market cap of $200 billion, and many of them even quadrupled their value since we won the elections. In addition, thanks to this process, we also repaid the accounts of Social Security, which was broken since its Sustainability Guarantee Fund was revaluated in $30 billion. These are the benefits of making the adjustment of violating contract. In other words, the mere fact of putting the tax accounts in order and lowering the country's risk made us, through a market mechanism, capitalize $30 billion of Social Security without putting a single peso. I mean, it seems like magic, but it is the market economy. In addition, it is very interesting because we always talk about that. And the joint action between the Treasury and the central bank allowed us to reduce the debt in an unprecedented way in Argentina to $30 billion. I also want to make a clarification because we all understand the value of independence to the central bank. The problem is, what did we do when the Treasury violated the central bank? I mean, many look at the balance of flows, and in reality, in real life, you have to look at place in stocks, and the stocks were pulverized by the Treasury. In fact, the maximum creditor of the National Treasury is the central bank, with debt around $120 billion. In fact, we had to make a unique write-off in history so that you can see how huge the Kaiserism is. The $45 billion. I mean, we had to make a rate cut in the balance of the central bank for $45 billion. That is to see the enormous debt of Borsali, because you cannot have monetary stability if you do not balance the central bank. I'm going to explain it, and I am going to do it with an example. By the way, I am also going to respond to the stupid Hans-Hermann Hoppe. I say because he dedicated himself to giving a conference criticizing MES without knowing the situation of Argentina. That went the other way round. For example, he says, no, the easiest reform was to close the central bank, saying there is a shock, because basically, in the central bank, either the remunerated passives that were at that time and the monetary base of the central bank, that happens. I say, I do it like this. The question, how much is today the debt of Enron? Come on, we are in the bag. Tira. Okay. Well, if I had closed the central bank, how much would it be worse without recomposing the balance of the central bank? That is, the real balance would have to be zero. And there are two ways to make real balance zero. One is because I rescue the debt. I rescue those monetary passives, and then I have zero. The others, if I did not rescue the monetary passives, how do I make it zero? It means that the prices have to go up to how much? Up to infinity. I go to a hyperinflation, the best card. I say for those who want, in mathematical terms, is called the transversality condition. You are going to do an exercise of dynamic optimization, any model to the Ramsey, with money, the dehydrated, whatever you want. In the transversality condition, it says that in the limit, with t tending infinity, the real balance is zero. So what does that mean? This idiot proposed to close it with our rescue, with which we would have generated a hyperinflation. Say the Peronism, the Kirchnerism, would have taken its rebel to the street, because we would have fulfilled the prophecy of being liberated, instead of being libertarian liberals. And in that context, the Kirchnerism come back. And on top of that, with all the fire, we would have annihilated the principles of freedom. That is why the problem of the stocks is important. Saving the balance of the central bank is important, because as I am saving the balance of the central bank, and it means that I can rescue capacity. That means that long-term inflation, in reality, means that the price level at the long term is lower, and therefore if the price level today with that long term, the slope gives inflation, and therefore it is getting lower. If I am here, and this was here, every time I lower it, because I am recomposing, the slope is getting lower. That is, the inflation rate is lower. It is a way to lower inflation, and the balance of the central bank is a question of stocks. I think it was worth mentioning. And also, we said that, in fact, I think it was this week, I said, it is hard for me, because it was quite intense, like all of them. But this was a bit worse, because I was sleeping 4 hours a day, so it is a bit more intense. They gave me the Ronald Reagan Prize. It has to do with having fulfilled my commitment with the taxpayers. I do not call them taxpayers. I call them taxpayers, but the price is a reference to the taxpayers. The commitment I made at the time of the elections is to not raise or create taxes and work as hard as possible to eliminate taxes. We have just made a big tax cut. That is to have eradicated the tax evasion. That is the tax evasion. In fact, the previous government had issued 13 points of the GDP, so that the deficit has grown to 15 points. So we returned the deficit to the Argentinians in the first 6 months, the equivalent of 15 points of the GDP, and we said that for a matter of cash, in a transitory way, we were going to raise the country tax, but that later we were going to eliminate that transitory raise, and later we were going to eliminate it completely. And alike all cases of transitory taxes since the 1930s, with the income tax or the IBA itself, let's see this, transitory a ticket to 21, or the debt and credit tax, bankers being permanent. And we, in the month of September, we lowered the country tax to the level that it was of originally. And if I'm not mistaken, for Monday, the country tax is eliminated, the first time in history. That is to say that it is the first time in history that a government fulfills precisely with eliminating a tax, apart from eliminating others, of well. And I have more good news, and it is that the tax cut will continue, as it is our irrevocable commitment to retain the surplus in the form of relief to the taxpayer, because less taxes is more competitiveness, and for all. When we present the new budgets, we will change the way of presenting budgets in Argentina, and we put together what is called the deficits era program, and we point out that when income from taxes rise and generate a surplus, what we are proposing is that if the increase is transitory, we accumulate it. That is, we generate a reserve. While if it is permanent, we are going to lower taxes. In fact, we are thinking about a tax reform where national taxes are no more than 6 taxes. And that is also another commitment. And it would depend on the economy growing. And the question is if the economy can grow. Look, the truth is that I had the privilege of talking with a number of economists, and one of them with whom I spoke was with Juan Pablo Nicolini, who recently made a study that shows what is the potential for Argentina's growth, even a tax balance, and he shows in that work, according to the calibration of a model of Robert Lucas Jr., that Argentina could grow to 4.5% per capita systematically. And the interesting thing is that when I talked to him, he said, no, this is only tax balance. That is, if one considers that the tax balance, we did shrinking the state, and also we are a machine to put structural reforms per market, 4.5% long, during an important period of time. Today it is a floor, and that is the best guarantee that we are going to get people out of poverty in a truly overwhelming way. So also, and that growth is going to be accompanied with an increasingly smaller state. And when I talk about prosperity for all, I also refer to the most vulnerable sectors, because you cannot neglect the victims of the populist system, which are the vulnerable. And in that sense, today with the EU8 and the food card, you can cover 100% of the basic food basket, while when we assumed it only covered 54%. That is, those who were filling their mouths. Talking about the poor, the only thing they did was multiply them. We who are the insensitive gave them total covered, and we also reduce the number of poor. They can eat everything, but also, we also take away from those who extorted them. What a change! Naturally, the real wages have been gaining on inflation for 6 months. And the lower the inflation, the more the wages will grow, as well as the rents. The poverty that we inherited, around 54% in the first quarter, the last estimates, way from the University of La Plata, and those made by Dyla, is around 38%. That is, in the third quarter, with which the indigency went down from 20% to 8.6%. And I want to stop for a second at this point, because I think it deserves to be emphasized. We inherited a country with around 57% of the poor, and having made it the largest tax adjustment in history, after it went down almost 20 points. That is why I had the privilege of having the opportunity to receive the visit of Thomas Sargent, because not only had we managed to lower the inflation, today the level of economic activity is about the level we inherited. The unemployment rate went down. The wages and rents in real times grew. And we are also exterminating poverty. All things that politics said were impossible, that many also believed were impossible. And what we are doing is making it possible. That is, we are building an Argentine economic miracle. And that is why I also ask you to continue to accompany us and trust us, because this institution was one of the few that trusted me. And I also want to thank you. Thanks you. In short, these are just some of the achievements of this government, and barely the tip of the iceberg of those who wait for us in the future. If we continue in this direction, the sustained growth will come to stay. I will put it more fundamentally. We, from our liberal perspective, we believe that the central bank is an institution that can only do damage, and that is why we believe in backlash currency competition. We believe that the central bank should be eliminated. I say the Argentine history is killing me, because if we look from 1935 onwards, the history is killing me. Also, I'm not going to deny it. I am philosophically an enraptured capitalist. Therefore, I believe that the state is a criminal organization that lives from a parasitic income called taxes. And therefore, the smaller the state, the greater the freedom. And we will all be much better. Therefore, this is still intact. I am in a world that has restrictions, but I ask you a question or a challenge. I propose that you find a situation of the government in a democratic environment that enters in electoral year, proposing deficit zero, that is, without expansionary tax policy and zero emission, that is, without expansionary monetary policy. We are the first government in the history of humanity in a democracy that does that, because we believe that politics is not meant to screw people's lives, and that the best thing the state can do is run away from the middle and let the private sector express itself freely. On the other hand, going back to the issue of growth, we also have to explain where we believe this growth comes from. And there are two main reasons. One is consensual and the other is structural. The consensual has to deal with the cyclical recovery of our economy, driven by the recomposition of salaries and pensions, thanks to the destruction of inflation, as I explained before. And there is also another effect, which is the stock recomposition of companies. After a brutal overstocking to protect themselves from inflation last year, and a subsequent liquidation of inventories during the first semester of this year. All this also explains the formidable growth in our economy during the last two trimesters. That is, the economy began to recover in April. The other reason, the structural, has to do with everything we are doing as a government. The saving of 15 points of the GDP compared to previously corrupt politics. And this year it has been returned to the private sector. It is already being translated into greater investments and greater consumption. See, we were talking about hyperinflation. Today we talk about 30-year mortgage loans. It seems to me that there is a small change. On the other hand, that in the background says that if you increase the savings, let's say because the tax has reduced, therefore we will be without a doubt much better. In fact, I'm going to tell you something. If we were at the most obscene end of everything we consume, the fact that we consume our money, what we feel like, and not that the politician spends it, that he does not know what our preferences are. Already with the we have a gain in well-being, with the intense way of saving that we Argentines have. Because when you look at the Argentine savings rate, you would have to decompose between the public sector and the private sector. When you see the available income that the private sector has, and the savings that we have in the economy, especially in the private sector, you will see that we Argentines save a lot. Therefore, we have a huge potential to invest, and consequently to grow strong way, so that you can invest. You also have to accompany the interest rate. Therefore, we have growth basis. We have basis of greater savings. And now we need, for example, low interest rates. Well, the lowering of the country's risk, and consequently of the interest rate. This reduces the intrinsic cost of the accumulation of capital. Therefore, this produces a direct increase in investment. And this we are also seeing. Not for nothing, we have a boom of mortgage loans, bigger than this country has seen. Moreover, we have the reg issue, that we already have applications for the equivalent of almost $12 billion. And as I made it say, as I like to go on a trip to walk, in the last trip, I brought almost 3,000 green investment sticks, which is the investment of Rio Tinto for $2,500 million, and the austerities that they are going to apply here for about $400 million for the motorbikes of the RAM. Anyway, let's say we have seen these results. I'm excited to travel a lot, because every time I leave, always someone does something to me. Without saying goodbye. We also have the monetary issue, the convergence of the parallel and the official exchange rate, made completely unpublished in history. Given that it always happens the other way round, it brings us day by day to a definitive exit of the CEPA, an abomination that should never have existed in the first place, and we are going to make it disappear forever next year. I mean, this is also incredible. I remember that we were traveling with Toto to what was going to be my exhibition in San Val, and if I'm not mistaken, we were going with Toto and we were going with Damien. Oh, I warn you that today, when I get out of here, I'm going to record the announcements that we are going to make in Niclimat. Literally, they are going to fall off. Thanks you. And I remember that we were in a very complicated situation. In the monetary market, we were receiving a speculative attack. The price of the dollar had touched the 1,500 pesos. They said it was going to go up to 2,000 the following week, and so on. And so we were in the phase of monetary policy as there is supply. We decided to go to zero emission. Zero supply was because we were only issuing against dollars. But when you have CEPA, that sale of dollars does not mean that you are buying pieces because you want to make transactions, and not because you are forced to liquidate them for the most. Therefore, there were more cases in laws that really wanted a net a floor to inflation, and we needed to correct that. And then we went to the zero emission plan directly. We knew that in the short term, the turbulence would continue, that we were convinced that inexorably the exchange rate gap was going to collapse. And we said that it was going to collapse, and that we were going to meet with a scenario where, for the first time in history, the closure of the gap was going to be from top to bottom, that is, from the parallel to the official, and not by a jump from the official. Obviously, it was impossible. For all those who are aware of the data, today we have the same type of change from the moment in which we nominally assumed office. Therefore, that also seemed impossible for us. We also made it possible. But I also want you to know that we are advancing in different solutions for the collapse of the central bank stocks and its subsequent closure. That is, the idea of ending the central bank did not escape us, but it sometimes turns out to be funny, because just as I talked about currency competition, and they called it dollarization, and I propose that you see the report that Pablo Rossi makes when he announces it in La Nación Mos, and I talk about currency competition, and they put sign that said dollarization. But apart from that, I never said that the central bank was closing instantly, like the release of hope, and all the local elites that repeat the central bank is not closing. I said that at least it was going to take 4 years to close it. It is go one and I come from. I can assure you that today, balance of the central bank is much more than what we had, and that we are getting closer to the situation, and that we are playing a very important role. The model of currency competition, because I say this, not only to end with inflation forever, but it will stand. There's some points that I have to mention about the positive load. But what I want to hear is that today there is already the currency competition. Today you can make transactions in any currency that you want, because we accelerated the process of launching currency competition so that the type of change does not collapse. That is, well, there is a set of primates saying that there is a problem of appreciation. We had to launch so that we do not destroy the tie and give. We demand, on the other hand, that this year in the future, with all the energy projects, the dollars will not come out by the hour. Then what we need is to create demand for those dollars, and that will generate what we call the dollarization endogenous, where it begins to see turning the economy into a museum, and there will be a moment that the difference will be so gross that dollarization is nothing. Closing the central bank is nothing. The last stage of the process is when you can pay the taxes in dollars, which is not yet. But this is the last stage of that process. So you already know that the day we enable you to pay the taxes in dollars, let's say the building of Reconquista 266 will become a museum. And I also think that it is worth a digression about the discussion of appreciation, because again they were. Because it is interesting, when the dollar is up, we go to the hype. When the dollar goes down, Argentina is super expensive. So what I want to tell you is why we believe that there is no appreciation change. When you think there's appreciation change, they should have some elements to base that vision. Well, that is methodologically wrong, because I can understand that other economists adhere to other methods, and the other difference goes to which I adhere, and they can do that and consider that it is correct. Let's see. A process of appreciation change. One of the things that would have to generate is greater loss of reserves. Let's say the central bank. We composed reserves for the equivalent of $25,000 million, and the 200% gap almost disappeared. Therefore, that indicator would not be pointing out that the fundamentals show appreciation change. Another way to maintain appreciation change is with debt in more than $30,000 million. Therefore, it would not be working from that channel. Another way to appreciate the currency is that the central bank raises the interest rate to make the type of change fall. We see him with an interest rate of 235%, and today that rate is 35%. Therefore, it does not work. That is, when I look at the fundamentals, truly those things would not be happening to give substance to that. Not only that, but also suppose that I think of a model of transables and not transables, and it appears, let's say, a reasonable discussion in the light of what we want, raise. And the type of real change in that case is the price of non-transables, where the price of transables is the type of change multiplied by international prices. Then let's suppose that we start from a situation of equilibrium. Then, now, an excess falls and breaks me half of the non-transable sector. What happens in that case? I have a contraction of the non-transable sectors. Therefore, if I started from a situation of equilibrium, Paysan would not have to be changing the demand functions because the prices have not changed yet. It is difficult to do the comparative static exercises without the equations telling it like that. But very well, very well. Then what has to happen in the economy? It has to raise the price of non-transable. And why does it have to raise the price of non-transable? Because it is where the scarcity was generated. Then I have the same demand. I contract the supply, I have scarcity then. Then, let's say it changes the relative prices. It changes the set of demand functions. And consequently, I have another set of prices. And what does it start to do? It starts sending me signals that I have to invest in the non-transable sector because an exocet has just fallen. Now, if I take the club of the devaluators, in the face of that case, what do they tell me? Devalued, devalued. Because the type of real change, did you appreciate it? No, actually, I have a signal that I have to invest in a non-transable sector. This is not minor, because it means that under this context, and this situation continues, the energy sector and the mining sector, and that we are going to export so much. Therefore, I warn you that there is a furious opportunity for business within the non-transable sector. And what is the characteristic of the non-transable sector? For example, the services are intensive in labor. Therefore, this will also bring much improvement in the employment and in the real wages, which will be a machine to lower poverty and indigency. On the other hand, if we listen to these moans of devaluation, we break the resource allocation. We do not recompose the sector that we have to recompose, and therefore we have a deterioration in the quality of our lives. I say that it is the methodology that we regularly use from 35 to here, except during the convertibility. But you can tell me yes, the graph of the type of real change is wrong conceptually. First of all, because what is the type of real change of balance? What is it? You are going to tell me that you know the price balance sector of the economy, because to say that it is traced, you have to know which is the correct one. And if you know which is the correct one, you would have to know the preferences of all individuals in the economy from today to eternity, with which you also have to know how the population is going to evolve. You have to know how technology is going to evolve. You have to know how the donations are going to evolve. You have to know the price balance factor. Hayek, in his aspect called fatal conceit, says that these things, if we need a price balance sector between us and the socialite, there would be no difference. That's why he called it fatal conceit, because there is no way to know that. It is not only a problem of not knowing, if not. Besides, it would require omissions, omnipresence and omnipotence, because when you press the right button, it does not exist, except unless you think you are God. And if there is something that I found clear, it is that politicians are quite far from that. But apart from that, I will tell you how economists solve this issue. take an average, irritating and insulting, where they cut the series. Why do they cut the series in 2002? There are several problems. Because if you cut the series in 2002, you have the nefarious period and sinister of the culturism. If there is something that characterizes the situation, when you have an unrepresentable government, the currency is destroyed. And when you have a serious government, the currency appreciates. Then that gives them a certain type of change that we already saw that in the methodology it is a trick. Because we do not know what the price balance vector is. This correction is also a trick. Because he says we're the cutters. Who knows what the balance situation was? Then notice that if you extend the series until including the convertibility, and they do it since April 1991, when the process actually started in January, when all the stabilization begins, and then the first one is launched, and the 1st of April, there the type of change gives 700. Then imagine if I only cut the series during the convertibility, because we want to generate a balance, favorable expectations, or perhaps we do not believe in freedom, which would be logical and unreasonable. The currency is appreciated. Then what I say is also the methodology has many problems. And this is the last one. Because again, the deviations won the core. Suppose that the creator comes and says this is the vector that was given in the year say much. They had the revelation. What do we do with that data? That data has a set of conditions. Our supply and demand, not only in the local markets, but also in the international markets. Suppose I do not know Roman 20 of the year 97, the conditions of supply and demand of each of the viruses in the Argentine economy and in the world clearly is not the same. Therefore, extrapolating that number, I'm going to say in Latin, is a ball of the size of a house. Therefore, we did the only thing that can be done, understanding how limited our knowledge is. We give honor again to Friedrich von Hayek, Nobel Prize in 1974, if I am not mistaken. And in that context, as we do not have the pretense of knowledge, we never that we do not have it. We only that the tax policy does not screw us with their deficit, and that the monetary policy does not screw us with zero emissions, and that the prices are accommodated. Because if we hate it, we would be putting the same as the market puts. But in the middle, we would be doing a loss of damage to finance us to do that. Therefore, let the market do it. If the market can do it, we have to evaluate all the time. And I also want to announce the issue of impositivity. What we have in terms of tax reduction is explicit, that we are going to undertake next year through radical tax reform that will seek to simplify a tax code, as has been anticipated. Our goal is that there will be no more than 6 national taxes, so that Argentines can dedicate themselves better to what they know, which is to work and generating wealth. Now another good ad came. I became a bearer of good news. I remember that when I did the interview, Susana Jimenez, who asked, "Can you tell me for now on that from now on we will have all good news?" Yes. Look at that day and look at all the news that came out after that day. And that is thanks to a wonderful team that I have in government. And not only infinitely talented people, far so good people. And above all things, I am a bearer of good news. In terms of trade, we have a motto of freeing trade, so that consumers who can decide what they want to buy based on their own preferences. This will force companies used to having protectionists 1511, 122, 29,000, 122, 31,000, guaranteed by friends to compete with better products and our better prices to attract consumers, or even new ways to solve all problems, as Joseph Schumpeter anticipated, with a concept of creative destruction that should not be confused with the creativity for the destruction. That was what brought us here. And all this places before us a historical opportunity. We must not go too far and on this topic. Basically, what I have to tell you is that we are actually going to have a free trade treaty with the United States, and today the voice of the elected President of the United States, Donald Trump, reaffirmed that we are going to work to get a free trade treaty. So therefore, in truth, I have a lot more good news, but I already deviated so much that I prefer to close and stop bothering them with my presence, because in short, I want to start the closure with a confusing phrase that says that the man who moves mountains begins by moving small stones. I think that we have moved a few. In fact, we have made the largest reforms in Argentine history in just 1 year, with 15% of the House of Representatives and 10% of the House of Senators, and that also implies a debt of gratitude to fellow deputies and senators of other forces such as the pro as the case of the radicals who have decided to support us, and as the case of governors, both the deputies for the change as of the Peronist Party who have supported and accompanied these reforms, because without their help this would have been infinitely more difficult. And that is why we also want to thank all these people who have accompanied us in making the greatest transformation in Argentine history, and that I have no doubt that in the face of the future we will continue to work together, because if those of us who are on the side of freedom, regardless of their political party, our commitment is with the Argentines of good and not with the churros, and that is why I think that we will be able to move forward and be able to continue working to have a better Argentina. And finally, I want to thank you again, dear friends of La Bolsa de Comercio, for having received us, and again congratulate you on the building. Moving from home after having been so long in the same place is an important leap. Sometimes you have to leave behind affections and nostalgia to encourage yourself to take a leap forward. Change is a central part of life, and you have to do the best you can with it. So I want to wish you that you have a very good afternoon, that you have some beautiful parties that start a beautiful year, because we are going to have a fabulous 2025 and that the forces of heaven accompany us and
¡Viva la libertad, carajo!